In June 1941, along a frontier stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, two very different communication systems faced each other. On the German side, field armies advanced with radio networks that had been tested in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Each army and corps possessed signals, regiments equipped with short and medium wave sets, direction-finding units, and trained intercept teams. On the Soviet side, 5 Western military districts held more than 170 rifle and mechanized divisions, but many formations entered the crisis with incomplete radio equipment, shortages of trained operators, and a doctrine that favored silence on the airwaves. The interwar Red Army had expanded faster than its signals infrastructure. In the early 1930s, Soviet doctrine emphasized centralized control from front and army headquarters down to corps and divisions, transmitting orders through wired telephones and telegraphs where possible. Radio was treated as a tool for mobile units and a temporary replacement when cable lines were cut. Training manuals stressed that radio traffic could be intercepted, its direction located, and its content read if codes were mishandled. As a result, commanders were encouraged to regard radio as a last resort, not a routine instrument. By 1939, the Red Army began forming large mechanized corps with hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles. A typical mechanized corps might have more than 1,000 tanks on paper, but only a fraction of the required radio sets. Many tank battalions received a single command tank with a transmitter, while the rest relied on flags or pre-arranged signals. Rifle divisions were in a similar position. Divisional headquarters usually had radio links to corps, but regiments and battalions often depended on field telephones, runners, and motorcycle messengers. When these formations were pushed forward into the newly annexed territories of 1939 to 1940, the gap between their mobility and their means of communication widened. The annexation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia added complex layers to the Soviet communications picture. Pre-war Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Romanian telephone networks existed, but their integration into the Soviet system was incomplete by mid-1941. Trunk lines leading eastward were under construction or reconfiguration. New command posts of Western Special, Kiev Special, Baltic, and Odessa military districts were sometimes located in areas where the cable network was still being surveyed or rebuilt. As divisions moved into forward camps near the new frontier, their field telephone lines had to be stretched over greater distances, often vulnerable to weather and sabotage. Inside the Soviet command structure, responsibility for communications lay with specialized signals troops and the 8th Directorate of the General Staff, which supervised cipher systems. The late 1930s purges removed a portion of the senior officers in these areas, just as in other branches. In some cases, commanders with long experience in radio and cryptography were arrested or dismissed, and their replacements had fewer years of service. Military academies for signals officers continued to operate, but institutional continuity was disrupted, affecting doctrine debates and equipment programs at a time when the army was expanding to more than 5 million personnel. German intelligence assessed these developments with growing interest. Signals intercept units deployed in East Prussia, occupied Poland and Romania monitored Soviet radio traffic during peacetime maneuvers and border incidents. Traffic analysis allowed them to identify the approximate locations of Soviet district headquarters, armies, and some corps. They noted periods of strict radio silence and sudden bursts of activity during larger exercises. For German planners, these observations confirmed that the Red Army tried to conceal its order of battle in the ether, but also revealed that, when Soviet units did use radio under pressure, procedures were inconsistent and security measures varied. Political calculations deepened the Soviet reluctance to rely openly on radio. After the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact, Moscow sought to avoid actions that Berlin might interpret as preparation for an imminent attack. Orders from the top stressed the need to strengthen the Western districts, while avoiding visible mobilization steps that could be considered provocative. Bringing large numbers of radios into continuous operation along the border, rehearsing combat nets, and transmitting frequent encoded messages risked attracting German attention and feeding alarmist interpretations. In this climate, commanders often preferred cable lines, written courier packets, and personal conferences. Economic constraints also shaped the pre-war signals situation. Soviet industry produced large numbers of field telephones, switchboards, and cable reels, but the manufacture of compact, reliable radio sets lagged behind the pace of force expansion. In 1940 to 1941, new models were introduced for tank, artillery, and aviation units, yet distribution remained uneven. Maintenance workshops reported shortages of spare tubes, batteries, and skilled technicians. In some Western districts, inventories showed that only a minority of battalions had functioning radios, and many sets lacked complete accessories or trained crews. At the same time, Soviet cipher services faced the challenge of supplying codebooks, one-time pads, and key material to expanding formations. Secure systems existed and were used at higher echelons, but lower-level units often operated with simplified codes, prearranged phrases, or, under field pressure, plain language training instructions warned that careless use of radio could give an adversary valuable information, reinforcing the tendency to limit transmissions, except in emergencies. This combination of caution, incomplete equipment, and administrative strain defined the communications landscape on the eve of war. By the night of 21st to 22nd June 1941, the Red Army in the western border districts possessed significant firepower and manpower, but its internal nervous system was fragile. Headquarters depended on fixed lines that could be severed by saboteurs or airstrikes, while the reserve of radios, operators, and cipher clerks was insufficient to replace lost cables quickly on a large scale. Across the frontier, German armies prepared to move with signals units integrated into each echelon, accompanied by intercept companies ready to listen for any Soviet transmissions. The confrontation that followed would test not only weapons and tactics, but two contrasting beliefs about how much a modern army should speak on the air. Before dawn on 22nd June 1941, the first signs that something was wrong arrived as fragmentary reports rather than clear orders. Border guards along the Bug, Niemen, and Prut rivers signalled skirmishes, aircraft crossings, and artillery flashes to nearby posts. Local commanders tried to reach higher headquarters by telephone, only to find lines busy, unanswered, or already cut. In this first hour, the structure of Soviet communications, with its dependence on fixed cables and restricted radio use, shaped how news of the attack filtered upward. Shortly after midnight, the People's Commissariat of Defense and the General Staff drafted an instruction to the Western districts. It warned of a possible German provocation and authorized district commanders to bring some units to readiness without crossing the frontier. Transmission of this directive relied primarily on telegraph and telephone channels to the Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa districts. Where direct wires existed, the message arrived within about 1 hour. Where lines had to be relayed through intermediate nodes, delivery took longer. In several cases, cipher departments received the text but needed additional time to encode and pass it to operations officers. As German artillery opened fire around 0315 to 0330 in multiple sectors, the shockwave reached Soviet headquarters unevenly. In the Baltic Special Military District, some forward units had already received alerts from their commanders, who chose to act on the midnight instruction. Divisions near Kaunas and Tilsit began to disperse from barracks and move toward pre-assigned positions, calling back along telephone lines for clarification. In the Western Special Military District around Bialystok and Brest, several rifle divisions had not yet completed the deployment ordered in previous days. Their communication staffs were still laying temporary cables when German shells severed trunk lines leading to the district center in Minsk. At Brest, the headquarters of the 4th Army and the 6th Rifle Corps found themselves near the main axis of attack. Initial German bombardments destroyed telephone exchanges, cut cables, and damaged radio masts. Signals companies attempted to restore wire connections within the fortress and to neighboring units, but repeated strikes forced them to switch to runners and motorcycle couriers. Radios that could have linked these units directly to army or district level were present in limited numbers, and operators had been instructed to avoid transmitting without explicit permission. In the opening confusion, some sets remained silent or were used only for short, uncoordinated messages. Further south, in the Kiev Special Military District, reports from border detachments along the San and Bug rivers arrived at district headquarters with varying delays. Some came through still intact telephone lines, others through NKVD channels that had their own communication network parallel to the army. The district commander and staff had to reconcile civilian, security, and military reports before issuing orders. With radio nets only partially activated and cipher channels congested. Written instructions to armies and corps were often dispatched by courier in duplicate or triplicate, each motorcycle or car following a different route to improve the chance of arrival. On the German side, the opening phase also depended on signals, but in a different manner. Army and Corps headquarters moved with dedicated signals. Regiments that had laid communications plans in advance. Field cables followed the main attack axes, linking forward divisions to rear command posts. High-frequency radio sets connected army groups to Berlin and to Luftwaffe commands. At the same time, specialized intercept units began to monitor Soviet frequencies identified during pre-war observations. In the early hours of 22nd June, these teams recorded bursts of Soviet transmissions, many of them short, confused, and unevenly encoded, as local commanders broke radio silence under pressure. German situation reports from these intercept units noted that, in several sectors, Soviet radio activity initially increased and then dropped sharply as command posts were overrun or power supplies interrupted. In other sectors, particularly in the south, they observed a gradual buildup of transmissions as Soviet formations attempted to re-establish control after the first strikes cut telephone lines. Traffic analysis rather than content often provided the quickest clues. Sudden disappearance of a known call sign could indicate that a headquarters had moved, been destroyed, or lost its equipment. Within Soviet front and district headquarters, duty officers tried to assemble a coherent picture from incomplete fragments. Operations logs from Western and Baltic districts show repeated entries such as no contact with X division, line broken, command post presumed relocated, and message dispatched by courier. Staffs resorted to broadcasting generalized instructions over radio in plain or lightly coded language to any unit that could receive them, ordering withdrawal to second echelons or counterattacks according to pre-war contingency plans. This improvised use of radio deviated from peacetime guidance and increased the chances that German intercept services could follow Soviet attempts to regroup. Individual commanders encountered the communications gap at a personal level. Corps and division leaders drove towards subordinate headquarters to deliver orders in person when telephones failed, sometimes travelling for hours, only to find positions already abandoned or engage staff cars and liaison aircraft became critical carriers of information. But they were vulnerable to air attack and changing front lines. The reliance on physical movement of orders, which had seemed acceptable in pre-war exercises, now collided with the speed of an opponent using coordinated radio, cable, and air reconnaissance. By the end of 22nd June, the opening phase of the campaign had exposed the differing assumptions embedded in each side's communication system. German command benefited from pre-planned radio nets and flexible use of intercept data to refine its picture of Soviet reactions. Soviet command, oriented toward wired networks and cautious radio doctrine, faced fractured lines, overloaded cipher services, and an urgent need to improvise alternative channels. The day closed not only with territorial gains and losses, but with a widening gap in how quickly each side could transmit orders, confirm receipt, and adapt to events unfolding along a front more than 1,600 kilometers long. Planning for the 1941 campaign on both sides linked strategic aims with assumptions about how orders would move between headquarters and the front line. German leaders expected a short war in the east. Barbarossa directives envisioned the destruction of the main Soviet forces west of the Dnieper and Dvina within 8 to 10 weeks, by 3 army groups advancing along separate axes. To sustain this pace, the German command system relied on mobile headquarters, radio links between panzer groups and Luftwaffe formations, and signals units capable of laying cable over dozens of kilometers each day. The communications network was treated as a weapon that had to be deployed and reinforced like artillery or fuel. Soviet strategic planning in 1940 to 1941 combined preparations for a prolonged conflict with an expectation that initial fighting would occur on or near the frontier. Revised field regulations emphasized centralized direction by the General Staff and front commands, with armies and corps acting according to detailed operational plans. Signals troops were tasked with ensuring continuous wired links between front, army, and corps headquarters, while radio was designated mainly for reserve formations, mechanized units, and aviation. The underlying assumption was that, once mobilized, most large formations would operate inside a web of fixed and field cables reaching back to Moscow. As the Red Army expanded, planning documents called for a layered signals structure. Each front was to have a signals brigade, each army a signals regiment, and each rifle or mechanized corps its own signals battalion. These units were responsible for telephones, telegraphs, radio, and courier services. In practice, formation schedules often outpaced the ability to generate trained signals personnel. New divisions formed in 1940 and 1941 sometimes received only partial signals companies. Courses at Frunze and other academies trained officers in modern communications, but the removal and reassignment of senior specialists during the late 1930s meant that institutional experience in this field was uneven. The Soviet approach to cryptography reflected a similar desire for order and control. The 8th Directorate distributed multi-level cipher systems, high-grade codes for general staff and fronts, simplified ciphers for armies, and basic code tables for lower formations. The plan was to preserve security by limiting access to complex systems and by centralizing key distribution. However, rapid expansion created bottlenecks. In 1941, many newly formed divisions still awaited full sets of codebooks, and trained cipher clerk staffs therefore drafted contingency instructions that, in extreme situations, allowed for shorter messages, conventional call signs, or reduced encryption, while warning about the risks of such measures. Radio production plans attempted to support these structures, but struggled with competing demands. Armoured forces required compact sets for tank platoons and companies. Artillery demanded reliable links between observation posts and batteries. Air units needed airborne and ground control radios to coordinate interception and ground attack. Soviet industry introduced several models of field and tank radios in the late 1930s. Yet annual output had to be divided among existing and new units. Planning figures for 1941 showed that full radio equipment for all rifle divisions, mechanized corps, and air regiments would only be achieved over several years. Commanders were therefore instructed to prioritize key headquarters and use radio sparingly to avoid disclosing positions. German planning treated Soviet communications both as a vulnerability to exploit and as a source of intelligence. The Army High Command assigned each army group a set of signals regiments and attached intercept units specializing in Eastern languages and Soviet procedures. During the winter and spring of 1940 to 1941, these intercept units trained to identify Soviet frequencies, call signs and traffic patterns, based on material collected in earlier crises along the border. Their tasks included locating enemy headquarters by direction, finding, monitoring changes in traffic volume for signs of mobilization, and attempting to read low-grade codes when possible. Within German formations, doctrine encouraged flexible use of radio alongside cable. Panzer Group commanders were expected to operate far ahead of main infantry forces, relying on high-frequency sets to maintain contact with army headquarters, and with supporting air fleets, liaison officers carried additional radios to coordinate Luftwaffe strikes. Signals planners designed redundant routes so that if a field cable was cut, radio links could temporarily compensate until linemen restored the wire. This redundancy was built into Barbarossa orders as a necessary condition for maintaining operational tempo across large distances. At the tactical level, differences in planning were visible in tank and air units. German armoured battalions were equipped so that each tank had at least a receiver, and command vehicles had both transmitter and receiver, facilitating rapid changes of direction during battle. Soviet Mechanized Corps, by contrast, planned to use radios mainly in command tanks, with flags or prearranged maneuvers guiding other vehicles. Soviet planners aimed to improve this situation, but calculated that full radio equipment for all tanks would require industrial output and training capacity beyond what was available before 1942. In the air, Soviet pre-war plans relied heavily on ground-controlled interception and visual signals, while German doctrine increasingly stressed radio communication between aircraft and ground controllers during close support missions. Political considerations also entered planning for communications. Soviet directives in early 1941 instructed Western districts to strengthen readiness without taking steps that might appear provocative to Germany. Large-scale radio exercises near the frontier, frequent ciphered transmissions, or the activation of all wartime nets could be interpreted as signals of impending offensive operations. District commanders therefore balanced internal readiness plans with external signals of restraint. Some postponed comprehensive radio drills or limited them to rear areas, counting on cable networks and mobilization schedules to close any gaps if war came. These contrasting plans produced two different command and control architectures on the eve of the invasion. The German system emphasized mobility, redundancy, and aggressive use of radio combined with signals intelligence. The Soviet system sought to preserve security and centralize control through wired networks and cautious radio doctrine, while still in the process of outfitting rapidly growing forces. When the attack began, each side would test not only its operational plans, but also its assumptions about how an army of hundreds of thousands of personnel should speak, listen, and protect its messages under the conditions of modern war. The first large-scale clashes on June 22nd and 23rd exposed how communications performance could shape entire sectors of the front. In the northern sector, formations of the northwestern front around Kaunas and along the Niemen attempted to implement pre-war plans that called for counterattacks against German bridgeheads. Orders from front headquarters instructed the 8th and 11th Armies to hold prepared positions and, where possible, strike the flanks of advancing German divisions. These instructions moved by telephone and telegraph as far as Army headquarters, but transmission further down often depended on damaged local networks and improvised radio use. In some rifle divisions, regimental command posts received only fragments of these orders. When artillery engagements began, field telephones to battalions failed as poles and lines were cut by shellfire or abandoned during rapid withdrawals. Signals companies tried to relay messages through surviving lines or by laying new cable, but the pace of German advances and air attacks reduced their effectiveness. As a result, some battalions continued to hold forward positions that higher headquarters had already written off, while others withdrew on their own assessment of the situation, creating gaps that neighbouring units did not immediately recognise. The Baltic mechanized corps that were tasked with counterattacks faced similar difficulties. Corps staffs received urgent instructions to move toward designated assembly areas and launch attacks against identified German spearheads. However, communication between corps headquarters and dispersed tank and motorized divisions was uneven, with few radios available at battalion and company level, and many vehicles still concentrated in parks without full fuel loads. Orders issued in the early morning could not be synchronized across all units. Commanders relied on dispatch riders to carry written instructions along roads, already under air observation. Where these messengers were delayed or destroyed, subordinate formations acted late or on previous orders, reducing the concentration of force at the chosen time and place. In the central sector, the Western Front around Bialystok and Grodno became an early example of how communications gaps translated into operational dislocation. Front headquarters in Minsk attempted to coordinate counterblows by the 3rd and 10th Armies against German crossings over the Niemen and the Bug initial orders, transmitted over telephone and telegraph, reached Army command posts that were themselves beginning to displace eastward under pressure. When these headquarters relocated, some of their field lines were cut before alternative routes could be established. Radio nets that might have provided continuity had been only partly activated in peacetime and now had to be organised while units were already moving. Operations logs from Western Front show repeated attempts to contact specific corps and divisions by all available means. In several cases, headquarters could only confirm the approximate location of a formation hours after issuing an order. During this interval, German panzer divisions exploited road junctions and river crossings, deepening penetrations that Soviet planners had intended to counter. The counterattacks that did occur were often mounted by individual divisions or brigades acting on local initiative, rather than as coordinated operations under front-level control. On the German side, early reports from signals and intercept units accompanied the advance of Army Group Center. Direction-finding teams located Soviet radio transmitters that began broadcasting as wired networks. Failed analyses of call sign changes and message volumes indicated when new command posts appeared or where traffic suddenly ceased. Even when the content of higher-grade encrypted messages remained unread, German staffs could infer shifts in Soviet command locations and the collapse or withdrawal of certain headquarters. This information, combined with aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation, helped refine estimates of Soviet reactions without requiring a continuous picture. The opening battles in the south showed another aspect of communications strain. In the Kiev Special Military District, soon redesignated as the Southwestern Front, pre-war plans envisaged the use of large mechanized corps to strike German forces crossing the frontier in Galicia and Volhynia. Once hostilities began, front headquarters issued orders for counterattacks in the direction of Brody, Lutsk and Dubno. These orders covered several mechanized corps with more than 2,000 tanks on paper. Coordination required precise timing and knowledge of each corps' starting position, fuel state, and march routes. However, as columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery moved from peacetime garrisons toward assembly areas, their communications networks stretched to the limit. Corps headquarters attempted to control movements through a combination of radio messages to division headquarters and couriered orders to regiments. Many units had only a small number of functioning radios, and some sets were temporarily inoperable due to maintenance issues. Traffic jams on roads, shared with retreating infantry and refugees, slowed couriers. When front headquarters adjusted the axes of attack in response to changing reports, the revised orders sometimes reached formations hours after their original scheduled departure. At the same time, Luftwaffe attacks targeted bridges, road crossings, and known command posts. Field cables were severed repeatedly, forcing Soviet staffs to choose between relying on vulnerable telephones or resorting to broader, less secure radio calls. In several instances, German intercept units recorded Soviet messages instructing mechanized formations to change direction or concentrate at new points. Although these messages did not always provide detailed information, they confirmed to German commanders that counterattacks were forming. influencing their decision to reinforce certain sectors or to launch preemptive strikes along likely approach routes. For soldiers at the lower levels, the communication situation was felt in practical terms. Battalion commanders who lost contact with regiments had to decide whether to hold, withdraw, or pivot towards sounds of fighting artillery observers, unable to reach their batteries by telephone, resorted to prearranged firing plans or ceased fire to conserve ammunition. In tank units, platoon leaders without radio contact watched for signal flags or flares from company commanders, which were harder to see under conditions of smoke and dust. These improvisations sometimes achieved local successes, but made it difficult for higher headquarters to track the real position and readiness of their forces. Across the front, the first engagements of the campaign revealed that the collision of two large armies was also a collision of their command and control philosophies. German formations, accustomed to frequent radio use and backed by an organized intercept service, could update their understanding of Soviet movements on a near-continuous basis. Soviet formations, constrained by partial equipment, security concerns, and disrupted wired networks, often operated on orders that were already outdated by the time they reached subordinate units. The resulting time lag between decision, transmission, and execution would influence the course of encirclements and retreats in the weeks that followed. As June 1941 turned into the last week of the month, the initial shock along the frontier became a broader crisis of control. On the central axis, the German advance toward Minsk stretched communications on both sides. Army Group Center pushed two panzer groups ahead of following infantry, lengthening its own cable lines and increasing dependence on radio opposing them. The Soviet Western Front tried to coordinate withdrawals and counterattacks by formations that were already losing contact with each other. Operational maps in rear headquarters showed divisions and corps in positions they had left hours before, while new reports arrived late or not at all. The encirclement forming around Bialystok and later around Minsk illustrated this process. German panzer divisions swung north and south of the salient, while infantry followed to close the ring. Within the pocket lay elements of more than 20 Soviet divisions from the 3rd, 10th and 4th Armies. German claims after the battle cited over 300,000 prisoners taken in this sector. Soviet post-war studies counted several 100,000 personnel lost in these formations through capture, death, or breakdown of units. Inside the pocket, divisional and corps headquarters attempted to maintain links using surviving field radios and runners, but their access to front or general staff channels diminished rapidly once outer telephone lines were cut. Signals logs from Western Front headquarters record periods when entire armies dropped out of contact for many hours. Staffs could sometimes hear short, urgent radio messages from encircled units requesting permission to break out or asking for clarification of larger plans. Cipher sections, working with limited personnel, had to choose which messages to process first. Some commanders therefore resorted to simpler code tables or partially encoded phrases to save time. German intercept units monitoring these frequencies noted a rise in traffic that used recognizable patterns or less complex encryption, which increased the value of their direction, finding and traffic analysis, even when full decryption remained difficult. German communications also experienced strain as operations escalated. As panzer groups advanced beyond pre-war Polish infrastructure toward Minsk and further east, field cables had to cross greater distances, sometimes through areas lacking prepared routes. Signals regiments laid lines along main roads and railways, but gaps remained, especially in wooded or marshy terrain. Commanders relied more heavily on radio for contact between forward spearheads, supporting infantry corps, and Luftwaffe formations flying reconnaissance and ground attack reports from German staffs mention occasional congestion on key frequencies and the need to impose stricter radio discipline to prevent overlap and confusion. In the south, the large tank engagements around Brody and Dobno created another communications crisis. The Soviet Southwestern Front committed several mechanized corps with a combined strength of more than 2,000 tanks on paper against German Panzergruppe I, which fielded roughly 600 to 800 tanks, depending on the counting method. Orders from front headquarters directed multiple corps to converge on specific sectors to strike German spearheads from different directions to succeed. These moves required synchronized marches and clear knowledge of each corps' position. In practice, corps headquarters often knew their own units' locations only approximately, and contact with neighboring corps was limited. As mechanized columns moved, their signals detachments attempted to accompany them with field cables where possible, but speed and Luftwaffe attacks limited wired options. Tank and motorized units therefore depended on a small number of radios at regimental and battalion level. When front headquarters revised objectives or timetables, changes had to be transmitted by radio or courier to units already on the move. Some formations received updated orders too late to adjust their routes, leading to attacks that struck German forces piecemeal rather than in planned concentration. German intercept services, observing increased Soviet radio activity in certain directions, could infer where Soviet command intended to apply pressure and adjust defensive measures accordingly. Civilian communications networks were drawn into the crisis. Telegraph and telephone lines that had carried commercial and administrative traffic were requisitioned for military use or cut by retreating forces to deny them to the enemy railway communications, which coordinated the movement of trains carrying troops, equipment and evacuees, came under pressure from air raids and changing priorities. In some districts, local authorities received orders to evacuate factories, archives and key specialists, but lacked reliable channels to inform all relevant institutions. Delays of several hours or days in transmitting these directives meant that some industrial and civilian evacuations proceeded under direct threat of approaching front lines. Within Soviet High Command, the breakdown of front communications led to repeated adjustments of the command structure. New fronts were formed, such as the Reserve Front east of Smolensk, to take over troops arriving from the interior. Each new front required its own signals headquarters, cipher services, and links to Moscow and to neighboring fronts. Establishing these networks while trains and columns were still arriving created further congestion. General Staff reports from early July mention heavy loads on existing telegraph lines and the need to ration long-distance communications time among operational, logistical, and political messages. At the same time, the Soviet leadership had to communicate with foreign governments and with the population. Radio broadcasts from Moscow informed domestic and international audiences about the war, but these public messages relied on internal channels that were also serving front communications. Balancing domestic information policy with the technical need to keep operational nets free from overload became another aspect of the communications challenge. German monitoring of Soviet broadcast and high-power radio traffic added a further layer, as intercept units distinguished between open propaganda transmissions and military channels. For soldiers in encircled areas, the escalation of the campaign meant gradual isolation in the communications sense as well as in physical terms. Units that lost contact with higher headquarters sometimes received only general proclamations transmitted by powerful radio stations, urging resistance and breakout attempts without giving specific routes or rendezvous points. Commanders made decisions based on local reconnaissance rather than coordinated plans. German units attempting to seal pockets used their own radios to call in artillery or air support against detected breakout attempts, while listening for any remaining Soviet signals that might reveal concentration points. By early July, on multiple sectors of the front, the pattern of escalation and crisis in communications was clear. Where German advances severed wired networks and outpaced Soviet attempts to improvise alternative channels, Soviet headquarters struggled to impose coherent control on scattered formations. German forces, while also facing distance and infrastructure problems, maintained comparatively more continuous radio and cable integration, supported by a signals intelligence system that turned even fragmented Soviet transmissions into useful indicators. This imbalance did not by itself determine every local outcome, but it amplified the effects of operational successes and setbacks on both sides as the war in the East entered its next phase. In July and August 1941, the campaign reached a phase in which both sides attempted large-scale operations while their communication systems were under maximum strain. On the Central Axis, the Battle of Smolensk brought together 3 Soviet fronts and the spearheads of German Army Group Center. Between mid-July and early September, more than 40 German divisions and over 70 Soviet divisions were involved in this sector. High command decisions in Berlin and Moscow depended on how quickly signals from these formations could be collected, interpreted, and turned into orders. For the Soviet side, the creation of reserve and central fronts east of the Dnieper introduced additional layers of command. Each front headquarters brought its own signals brigades and cipher services, but these new structures had to be assembled while units arrived by rail and marched to staging areas. Telegraph and telephone links from Moscow to front headquarters were prioritized, yet connections from fronts to armies and from armies to corps remained incomplete in many places. Orders for counterattacks near Yartsevo, Roslavel, and later toward Dukovshchina were drafted in detail, but sometimes arrived at army command posts after German positions had already shifted. Within the Smolensk pocket, several Soviet armies found themselves in a situation similar to earlier encirclements, but now with more attempts at coordinated breakout, commanders used remaining radios to send condensed situation reports and requests for instructions. Stavka and front headquarters responded with general authorizations to break out towards specified lines, but the distance and the state of the networks meant that many formations had already begun moving on their own initiative. German intercept units monitoring Soviet frequencies recorded increased traffic as encircled headquarters compressed their messages, often using reduced cipher procedures under time pressure. This traffic gave German staffs indications of planned breakout directions, even when the exact wording remained unread. German command at this stage also faced the limits of its own communications. As panzer groups operated east and southeast of Smolensk, their distance from the main body of infantry grew. Signals regiments laid field cables along main supply routes, but rapid advances and Soviet demolition of infrastructure slowed this work. Contacts between forward panzer headquarters and Army Group Center relied heavily on high-frequency radio. Reports from German staffs mention cases where messages from panzer groups arrived with delay due to atmospheric conditions, frequency congestion, or the need to relay through intermediate nodes. These delays affected debates at the highest level about whether to push directly toward Moscow or to turn south. In the north, the approach to Leningrad involved complex coordination between Army Group North, Finnish forces, and the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe units operating around the Gulf of Finland. German signals units extended their networks along the Baltic coast and toward the Luga line, while also integrating liaison links with Finnish headquarters. Soviet northern and northwestern fronts tried to maintain contact with troops defending the Narva, Luga, and later the approaches to Leningrad itself. As front lines shifted, some Soviet army headquarters relocated multiple times in a few weeks, requiring rapid re-establishment of wired and radio connections. In wooded and swampy terrain, cable laying was slow, and heavy reliance on radio increased the opportunities for German intercept services to map defensive lines and detect regrouping. Soviet naval and air commands around Leningrad contributed additional layers. The Baltic Fleet maintained its own communications network, linking Kronstadt, coastal batteries, and naval infantry detachments. Coordination between fleet headquarters and land front commands depended on liaison officers and shared radio nets. Under air and artillery attack, some command posts had to move into underground shelters or ships, complicating the maintenance of stable telephone connections. German and Finnish intercept units monitored naval and air frequencies, gaining partial insight into Soviet intentions to reinforce particular sectors or evacuate certain positions. In the south, the peak of the summer campaign produced large encirclements at Uman and later around Kiev. In the Uman sector, German forces surrounded elements of two Soviet armies with more than 100,000 personnel. Communications within the pocket deteriorated quickly as headquarters moved to avoid capture. Radio messages requesting supplies or air support became shorter and less frequent. Some Soviet units attempted to use civilian radio stations or captured equipment, but their ability to reach front headquarters was limited. German intercept units recorded the decline in traffic from known Soviet call signs, treating the disappearance of certain transmitters as confirmation of the collapse of organized resistance in specific areas. Around Kiev, in late August and early September, communications influenced a major strategic decision. Soviet Southwestern Front reported both the strength of its defensive positions and the risk of German flanking movements from the north. These reports traveled through wired and radio channels to Stavka, where they competed with information about the central sector and the perceived threat to Moscow time lags in receiving accurate data on the depth of German armoured penetration south of Smolensk, contributed to differing assessments within the Soviet leadership. German signals intelligence, meanwhile, noted continued Soviet radio activity indicating firm command in the Kiev area, which reinforced the German view that a large encirclement opportunity existed if motorized forces could link up from north and south. Civilian and economic communications reached a peak of load in these months. Orders to evacuate industrial plants from the Dnieper Basin, Smolensk region, and parts of Leningrad and Ukraine had to be transmitted over the same telegraph and telephone lines that carried military traffic. Railway administrations coordinated thousands of evacuation trains through networks already taxed by troop movements and wartime disruption. Local authorities sometimes received evacuation directives by radio broadcasts relayed from central stations when direct administrative channels were overloaded or cut. These arrangements achieved significant transfers of factories and population, but also revealed the limits of a system designed for peacetime administrative flow rather than simultaneous large-scale military and civilian crises. By late August 1941, the Eastern Campaign had reached a point where the intensity of operations and the distances involved pushed both German and Soviet communication systems to their designed capacities. Radio, cable, couriers, and intercept services all functioned at high tempo. The way each side managed this peak period, balancing security with speed, redundancy with limited resources, shaped not only the outcomes of individual battles, but also the strategic choices that would lead to further advances, defensive stands, and encirclements in the autumn. By autumn 1941, both sides had learned that their pre-war assumptions about communications required rapid adjustment. For the Soviet command, the immediate task was to restore a minimum level of control. After repeated encirclements, Stavka issued new instructions that widened the use of radio at front and army level, even at the cost of greater exposure to interception. Front headquarters received additional radio sets from interior districts and moved part of their cipher services closer to operational formations in an effort to shorten message handling times. Training courses were compressed, with reserve officers and technicians reassigned to signals units to compensate for earlier losses. On many sectors, Soviet commanders began to combine remaining military networks with civilian resources. Railway communications offices provided alternate telegraph channels when army lines were destroyed. City telephone exchanges, where still functioning, were used to route calls between army and front headquarters. Local administrations allocated linemen and technicians to assist military signals units in laying cable and repairing poles. This integration did not remove all delays, but it created redundancy where previously some formations had relied on a single set of lines back to higher command. Adaptation also occurred at lower levels. Divisional and regimental staffs revised their internal procedures so that, when long-range communications failed, units could carry out agreed patterns of action based on time and location rather than continuous detailed orders. Pre-arranged schedules specified fallback lines rendezvous points, and artillery support plans for certain contingencies. This approach aligned with earlier doctrine, but now received greater emphasis, as commanders recognized that detailed real-time control was often impossible under conditions of rapid movement and air attack. Signals troops themselves adapted their practices in the field. Experience showed that keeping cable reels and poles close to command posts increased losses when enemy artillery found those locations. Many units shifted to laying lighter, more easily concealed lines that could be replaced quickly. Where armored or motorized formations moved through areas without usable infrastructure, signals detachments experimented with mounted cable teams and portable radio relays on trucks to bridge gaps temporarily. Reports from several fronts mention improvised relay stations established in villages or on high ground, linking forward battalions to divisional headquarters when direct line of sight was blocked. Soviet counterintelligence services likewise adjusted to the communications environment. NKVD units responsible for internal security deployed mobile groups that monitored radio discipline within formations, checking for unauthorized transmissions and improper use of codes. At the same time, they helped protect key communication hubs from sabotage and organized the destruction of equipment during retreats to prevent capture. Instructions were issued on how to disable radio sets, teleprinters, and switchboards quickly without leaving them repairable, reflecting a recognition that compromised equipment could assist enemy interception efforts. On the German side, adaptation focused on sustaining signals performance over extended distances and in worsening weather. As autumn rains turned many roads into mud, cable laying became more difficult. Signals regiments introduced more radio relay points along main axes and increased the use of directional antennas to maintain reliable high-frequency links between army group, armies, and panzer headquarters. Maintenance detachments received priorities for fuel and spare parts to keep generator trucks running, since power failures directly affected the availability of radio and telephone services. German intercept and evaluation centers also modified their methods. The volume of Soviet radio traffic had grown as Soviet command increased its reliance on wireless, and call signs and procedures evolved as new fronts were formed. To keep pace, German analysts compiled updated reference lists of Soviet call signs, frequencies, and common message formats based on material captured in field headquarters and training schools. Direction-finding networks were reconfigured to account for the shifting front lines, with some stations moving forward and others remaining in the rear to maintain baseline distances needed for accurate location fixes. Both sides began to pay more attention to training under combat conditions. Soviet signals schools in the interior revised their curricula to include case studies from the first months of the war, emphasizing rapid line restoration after air attacks, flexible routing of messages, and cooperation with civilian technical services. Selected officers and non-commissioned specialists were sent back from the front to act as instructors, bringing current field experience into classroom instruction. German signals training centers likewise incorporated lessons from the Eastern Campaign, including coping with extended supply lines, low temperature effects on equipment, and the challenge of managing high traffic volumes on shared frequencies. Among Soviet forces that had avoided encirclement or had been withdrawn for reconstitution, there was an increasing emphasis on standardized radio procedures. New instructions clarified call sign structures, message formats, and priority categories, aiming to reduce confusion when multiple headquarters shared limited channels. Some fronts established fixed times for routine situation reports, leaving other periods for urgent traffic. This regularity made network behavior more predictable for Soviet staffs and somewhat more legible to German intercept units, which could distinguish between baseline traffic and unusual spikes, but it also reduced the risk of accidental frequency clashes among Soviet formations. Emerging partisan groups behind German lines introduced another dimension of adaptation. In forests and rural areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, small detachments formed from soldiers who had escaped encirclement, local activists, and volunteers. To coordinate with Soviet command, they required radio links. Initially, only a minority possessed trained operators or suitable sets. Over time, Soviet intelligence and special services organized airdrops of compact radios and code material to selected groups. These channels operated at low power and on carefully chosen schedules to reduce the chances of direction finding. For German security and signals units, this development created dispersed, intermittent sources of traffic that were harder to track than regular frontline nets. By late 1941, resistance and adaptation in the realm of communications had become a continuous process rather than a series of isolated measures. Commanders on both sides altered procedures, redeployed technical resources, and revised training to meet the realities of a protracted campaign. The initial assumptions of June regarding radio silence, the sufficiency of fixed networks, or the expected duration of operations had given way to more flexible practices shaped by months of experience. These adaptations did not eliminate vulnerabilities, but they changed the balance of strengths and weaknesses that would influence subsequent operations in the winter and beyond. The months leading into the Battle of Moscow marked a turning point in how communications influenced the broader campaign. By September 1941, German Army Group Center prepared Operation Typhoon with the aim of encircling Soviet forces west of Moscow and capturing the capital. The operation involved more than 70 German divisions, including several panzer and motorized corps, advancing on converging axes through Vyazma and Bryansk. Coordinating these movements required sustained radio and cable links over distances that now exceeded those of earlier encirclements. At the same time, Soviet command reorganized its defenses into Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts, with orders to slow the enemy and prepare fallback lines closer to Moscow, supported by improved communications arrangements. German signals planning for Typhoon relied on extending existing networks along main railways and roads, while establishing additional radio relay stations to connect panzer groups with Army and Army Group headquarters. As the advance began in early October, signals regiments followed the armoured spearheads, laying cable where terrain and weather allowed. However, the onset of heavy autumn rains quickly transformed many roads into deep mud vehicles, carrying cable, poles, and generators experienced delays similar to those affecting ammunition and fuel convoys. In several cases, panzer headquarters outran their cable support and had to operate almost exclusively by radio, increasing dependence on high-frequency links that were vulnerable to atmospheric interference. On the Soviet side, the creation of a dedicated Moscow defense zone with its own communications hub altered the geometry of command. The capital already possessed dense telephone and telegraph infrastructure, including underground cables and protected exchanges. These networks were linked to the headquarters of Western and Reserve fronts through multiple routes, reducing the vulnerability associated with a single trunk line. New radio centers around Moscow relayed orders to front and army headquarters, which in turn had begun to rely more systematically on wireless after the experiences of summer cipher services near Moscow, and at front level expanded staff and adopted simplified but still controlled procedures to accelerate handling of urgent messages. The large encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk in early October illustrated both continuity and change. German operations succeeded in surrounding several Soviet armies, capturing or cutting off more than 500,000 personnel according to German claims, while Soviet sources later recorded comparable losses when combining killed, captured and missing. Within these pockets, Soviet communications deteriorated rapidly, as in previous cases. Yet, outside the encirclements, Soviet command managed to maintain more stable links between Moscow and newly designated reserve formations, arriving from the interior, from the Volga region, and from the Far East orders to move these units toward Mozhaisk, Volokolamsk and Serpukhov, travelled over secure Moscow-based networks less exposed to immediate frontline disruption. German signals intelligence, which had previously benefited from a relatively stable picture of Soviet front structures, now encountered a more fluid environment. The dissolution of encircled fronts and the rapid formation of new commands around Moscow brought changes in call signs, frequencies, and message routing. While German intercept units continued to gather Soviet traffic, the task of mapping new headquarters and assessing their composition took longer. At the same time, worsening weather affected both sides' radio propagation, introducing periods of poor reception and requiring frequency adjustments that complicated continuous monitoring. As German spearheads approached within roughly 100 to 150 kilometers of Moscow in late October and early November, the balance of communications advantages shifted. German field cables had to cross zones of destroyed infrastructure and muddy ground, while relay stations operated at the limits of generator capacity. Army Group Center reported increasing difficulties in maintaining timely contact with some panzer divisions during rapid local maneuvers or defensive adjustments. Soviet headquarters, by contrast, shortened many of their lines of communication as the front drew closer to the capital, allowing faster movement of couriers and more direct use of existing urban and suburban networks. In preparation for the December counteroffensive, Soviet command made deliberate use of communications measures as part of operational deception. Some reserve units were moved at night or under strict radio silence, with orders transmitted by courier or along secure Moscow-based cables, to conceal their exact locations from German reconnaissance and signals intelligence. In other sectors, normal or even increased radio traffic was maintained to suggest static or purely defensive intentions. German intercept and aerial reconnaissance detected indications of continued Soviet activity, but the full scale of force build-up near Kalinin, Klin, and south of Moscow remained unclear. When the Soviet counteroffensive began in early December, the impact of these communications choices became visible. Coordinated attacks by multiple armies along a broad front forced German command to adjust rapidly, redeploying reserves and shortening lines. For Soviet forces, the combination of shorter internal communications routes, expanded radio use, and prearranged operational plans reduced some of the delays that had characterized earlier campaigns. For German forces, retreat under winter conditions stressed the same networks that had already been near their limit during the advance, with cold affecting equipment reliability and complicating field repairs. The outcome around Moscow did not depend solely on communications, but the campaign marked a shift. The initial German advantage in integrating radios, cables, and intercept services faced the limits imposed by distance, climate, and attrition. Soviet command, while still experiencing losses and disruptions, had begun to adapt its systems, using the concentration of infrastructure around the capital and lessons from 1941 to restore a measure of strategic control. This turning point in the balance of communications capabilities set the stage for the prolonged, more symmetrical struggle that would follow in subsequent years of the war. The winter of 1941 to 1942 closed the first campaign in the East, with both sides reassessing what their communications performance had cost them. German formations that had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow now withdrew to new defensive lines, often under pressure from coordinated Soviet attacks. During this retreat, signals units were tasked with dismantling or destroying forward exchanges, relay stations, and cable networks that could not be moved. Equipment judged still usable was loaded on trucks or rail wagons. Damaged generators, poles, and reels were abandoned or rendered inoperable with explosives. In many villages and towns, civilian telephone and telegraph infrastructure remained in place but was disconnected or reconfigured to support the new German defensive posture. Soviet forces advancing westward in the counteroffensive encountered a landscape marked by previous communications battles. Along roads leading from Klin, Kaluga, and Tula, they found cut cables, wrecked switchboards, and radio masts used earlier by German headquarters. On recaptured airfields, signals detachments inspected ground control stations and antenna arrays left behind by Luftwaffe units. Some captured equipment was integrated into Soviet networks after technical inspection. Other items were sent to research institutes and training centers in the interior for analysis intelligence reports. Based on these finds documented German procedures for integrating radio, cable, and intercept tasks, providing reference material for future Soviet reforms. In areas that had remained under occupation, the civilian experience of communications breakdown was reflected in daily life. Many local telephone exchanges were reserved for military and administrative use, limiting public access. Telegraph services operated under censorship. An installation of new lines often followed military priorities rather than civilian needs. When front lines shifted again during the winter, some towns temporarily lost all long-distance communications, affecting the ability of families to trace evacuated relatives or to obtain information about supply deliveries and local regulations. For local populations, the technical choices of distant commands translated into practical questions of whether a message could be sent, received, or verified. For Soviet units that had been encircled and then dissolved, the aftermath involved formal reconstruction. Surviving officers and signals specialists were interviewed by commissions to establish circumstances of loss and to extract lessons on communications reports described cases where radio silence delayed requests for permission to withdraw, where the destruction of a single relay station isolated an entire sector, or where simplified codes used under pressure had allowed the enemy to anticipate movements. These testimonies entered staff colleges and doctrinal debates, forming a qualitative counterpart to the quantitative data in communications logs and loss tables. German signals intelligence centers reviewed their own records from 1941 in a similar spirit. Analysts compiled summaries of which Soviet cipher systems had resisted decryption, which had yielded partial or full solutions, and how often traffic analysis alone had sufficed to identify encirclement opportunities or impending counterattacks. They correlated spikes or declines in Soviet traffic with known operations, such as the Kiev encirclement or the December counteroffensive near Moscow, to refine their evaluation methods. At the same time, they noted an increase in Soviet radio discipline toward the end of the year, as well as more frequent changes in call signs and keying patterns, indicating growing awareness on the Soviet side of interception risks. Withdrawal and consolidation altered the communications geography on both sides. German forces shortened their lines, bringing many headquarters closer together and easing some of the technical burdens that had accumulated during the advance. However, they now had to maintain networks across territories with damaged or incomplete infrastructure, relying heavily on their own field systems. Soviet forces, still redistributing reserves and re-establishing control over liberated districts, faced the dual task of rebuilding local civilian communications and extending front networks westward from the Moscow region. Decisions about where to restore telegraph offices or repair rural telephone lines were influenced by both military needs and considerations of administration and economic recovery. The humanitarian consequences of earlier communications failures emerged gradually. Families of soldiers missing after encirclements or rapid retreats depended on military postal and registry systems to determine whether their relatives were dead, captured, or unaccounted for. These systems had themselves been disrupted by the loss of field post offices and records during the summer and autumn efforts to reconstruct service lists, and casualty reports relied on whatever fragments of communications logs, cipher registers, and operational reports had survived. In some cases, the absence of reliable records delayed notification for months or years. On the front line, the withdrawal phase coincided with a reordering of priorities within signals units. Maintenance and training, often deferred during continuous operations, now received more attention. German regiments repaired equipment in sheltered positions behind the front, while evaluating which models had performed reliably in the Russian climate. Soviet signals brigades around Moscow and in newly formed fronts used the pause relative to the summer tempo to standardize equipment where possible, redistribute radios and telephones according to revised tables of organization, and incorporate new personnel arriving from training schools. The end of the 1941 campaign thus did not close the story of communications in the Eastern War. Instead, it marked a transition from improvisation under shock to systematic adjustment. Retreats, encirclements, and local collapses had shown both commands the consequences of slow, fragmented, or compromised communication. The withdrawal and consolidation of winter 1941 to 1942 provided the space in which each side could absorb these lessons, archive their records, and begin planning how to address the exposed weaknesses and to reinforce the strengths that had emerged during the first months of contact. The long-term legacy of the 1941 communications crisis can be traced in three overlapping domains: operational practice, institutional memory, and historical interpretation. For the Soviet armed forces, the experience of June to December 1941 became a central reference point in post-war training and doctrine. Staff manuals and academy courses used case studies from Western, Southwestern, and Northwestern fronts to illustrate how delayed or fragmented communications contributed to encirclements around Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, and Kiev. Maps and timelines were paired with extracts from signals logs showing when specific headquarters lost contact with subordinates, when cipher services became overloaded, and how long it took for critical orders to reach frontline formations. One recurring conclusion in Soviet post-war analyses was that pre-war fear of interception had led to an underestimation of the operational costs of radio restrictions. Where commanders insisted on near-total radio silence and relied primarily on couriers and fixed lines, the collapse of wired networks in the first hours of the invasion imposed delays that could not be compensated by physical messengers. Reports compared the time needed for a motorcyclist to cover 40 to 60 kilometers under air attack and congested roads with the minutes required for a short radio message, even allowing for encryption. The lesson, as formulated in later regulations, was that secure radio use had to be planned and rehearsed in peacetime, rather than improvised in crisis. Institutionally, the purges of the late 1930s and the rapid expansion of forces before 1941 left a mark on how signals troops understood their own history. After the war, biographical dictionaries and internal studies attempted to reconstruct continuity in the development of Soviet communications theory, integrating the work of pre-purge specialists, wartime practitioners, and post-war reformers. Signals academies emphasized the need for stable career paths and technical expertise, arguing that frequent turnover in key posts before 1941 had hindered the consistent implementation of communications programs. The memory of earlier disruptions informed efforts to maintain a professional signals cadre in later decades. Technically, the shortcomings of 1941 accelerated investment in new equipment and procedures. Wartime and post-war industrial programs prioritized more compact, reliable radio sets for battalion and company level, standardized field telephones and switchboards, and improved encryption devices. The experience of seeing German intercept units exploit traffic analysis encouraged Soviet designers to consider not only the strength of ciphers, but also the patterns of network behavior. Manuals began to stress frequency management, call sign rotation, and controlled radio discipline as routine measures rather than exceptional precautions. In later conflicts, from late war offensives in Eastern Europe to Cold War exercises, Soviet planners sought to avoid the combination of underused radios and overburdened wired networks that had characterized 1941. On the German side, the early successes of signals intelligence in 1941 shaped expectations for future campaigns. Reports produced by intercept and evaluation centers highlighted how monitoring Soviet traffic, even when fully encrypted, had allowed German staffs to track the disintegration of certain fronts, identify the formation of new commands, and detect preparations for counterattacks. These reports influence post-war assessments by former officers, who often cited communications intelligence as one factor among others in explaining encirclements and operational breakthroughs. At the same time, later analyses acknowledged that as Soviet radio discipline improved and cipher systems evolved, the relative contribution of German interception decreased compared to 1941. Historians approaching this subject after the war have had to balance several types of evidence. German archival sources include intercept summaries, traffic diagrams, and analytical studies produced during the campaign, but they seldom provide a complete picture of what was heard or decrypted at specific moments. Soviet materials include communications logs, cipher registers, and after-action reports, many of which remained classified for decades. When these sources are compared, they show both convergences and gaps. In some cases, German claims about the timing of Soviet headquarters relocations can be cross-checked against Soviet records of lost lines and new radio activations. In others, surviving documentation is incomplete, leaving room for debate about the exact weight of communications factors relative to logistics, force ratios, and operational planning. From a broader perspective, the 1941 communications crisis has been interpreted in different ways by scholars focusing on technology, organization, or political context. Some studies emphasize the technology lag, the limited distribution of radios at battalion and company level, the vulnerability of cable networks to air and artillery attack, and the comparative density of German armoured units equipped with receivers and transmitters. Others stress organizational issues, such as the fragmentation of responsibilities between signals, cipher, and operational staffs, or the impact of rapid pre-war expansion without proportional growth in trained specialists. A third line of analysis places communications within the political framework of the time, arguing that concerns about espionage, internal security, and international signaling shaped pre-war doctrine toward radio use and code management. For participants, the memory of 1941 often took a more immediate form. Veterans of signals units, staff officers, and frontline commanders recalled specific episodes when the failure or success of a single line, relay station, or radio set altered the course of a local action. Their accounts mention messengers who did not return, orders that arrived after units had already withdrawn or been overrun, and improvised radio contacts that enabled a timely retreat or counterattack. These experiences reinforced the view, on all sides, that communications were not an abstract technical issue, but a daily concern closely linked to survival and effectiveness in the field. In military education, after 1945, both Soviet and foreign staff colleges treated the Eastern Campaign as an example of how communications could magnify strengths and vulnerabilities in large-scale operations. Exercises simulated the loss of fixed networks, the overload of cipher services, and the presence of enemy intercept units. Students were asked to design communications plans that balance speed, security, redundancy, and the realities of terrain and infrastructure. In this way, the events of 1941 contributed to a broader understanding of command and control in modern war, influencing doctrines far beyond the countries directly involved. The phrase radio silence disaster is thus not a single episode, but a shorthand for a complex interaction of doctrine, equipment, organization, and intelligence during the first months of the German-Soviet War. In June 1941, many Soviet commanders could not talk to each other quickly or securely enough because their systems were built around assumptions that did not match the conditions of a large surprise offensive by a technically integrated opponent. Over time, both sides adjusted, and later campaigns unfolded under different communications balances. The legacy of that initial mismatch remains visible in archival records, professional military education, and ongoing historical debates about how armies think, plan, and communicate under the pressure of war.